Alfonso Cahero, A Journey into Finance History, Chapter 45, Cuban Missile Crisis and Its Economic Sanctions, 1962. In the heart of the Cold War, the world teetered on the edge of annihilation. It was October 1962, and the Cuban Missile Crisis loomed ominously over the horizon. The United States and the Soviet Union, two superpowers locked in a bitter rivalry, found themselves on the brink of nuclear confrontation. But how did it all begin? The story starts with Cuba, a small island nation in the Caribbean, just 90 miles south of Florida. Fidel Castro had seized power in Cuba in 1959, leading a revolution that ousted the American-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista. Castro's rise to power sent shockwaves through Washington, which feared the spread of communism in its backyard. The Cuban Revolution, while celebrated by many as a victory for the people, was seen as a threat to American interests. Castro's government swiftly moved to nationalize American-owned businesses, angering U.S. policymakers. The stage was set for a showdown between the two nations. Castro's Cuba became a thorn in the side of the United States, especially when he began cozying up to the Soviet Union. In 1961, the CIA-backed Bay of Pigs invasion, aimed at overthrowing Castro, ended in disaster. This only pushed Castro further into the arms of the Soviets, who saw an opportunity to gain a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. The alliance between Cuba and the USSR sent shockwaves through the Western world. Now, not only was there a communist regime in America's backyard, but it was also armed and supported by the Soviet Union, America's greatest enemy. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation that would test the resolve of both superpowers. In the summer of 1962, American spy planes discovered something alarming in Cuba: Soviet nuclear missiles. These missiles, capable of striking targets across the United States, posed an existential threat. President John F. Kennedy faced a dilemma: how to respond to this provocation without triggering a nuclear war. The discovery of the missiles sent shockwaves through Washington. For the first time, the threat of nuclear war felt palpable. Kennedy convened his top advisors, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, to discuss their options. The consensus was clear: the missiles had to be removed, by force if necessary. Kennedy's response was swift and decisive. In a televised address to the nation on October 22, 1962, he revealed the presence of the missiles in Cuba and announced a naval blockade to prevent further Soviet shipments. The world held its breath as the two superpowers stood on the brink of nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis gripped the world in fear. In Washington, schools conducted air raid drills, and bomb shelters were hastily constructed. In Moscow, citizens braced for the worst as tensions between the superpowers reached a fever pitch. The fate of the world hung in the balance as Kennedy and Khrushchev played a high-stakes game of brinkmanship. As tensions escalated, behind-the-scenes diplomacy kicked into high gear. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev exchanged secret letters, seeking a way out of the crisis without resorting to war. Meanwhile, the United Nations became a battleground for competing narratives, with the US and the USSR each presenting their case to the world. The diplomatic dance between the two superpowers was tense and fraught with danger. Both sides were unwilling to back down, yet neither wanted to be responsible for starting a nuclear war. Through back channels and intermediaries, Kennedy and Khrushchev searched for a way to de-escalate the crisis and avoid catastrophe. The naval blockade, euphemistically termed a quarantine to avoid the legal implications of a blockade, was a bold move by the Kennedy administration. By stationing U.S. naval vessels around Cuba, they hoped to prevent further Soviet shipments of missiles and military equipment to the island. But the blockade carried significant risks. As American ships steamed toward Cuba, tensions reached a boiling point. Soviet ships carrying cargo destined for Cuba approached the blockade line, raising fears of a confrontation at sea. The world watched nervously as the two superpowers stood on the brink of war, their fingers hovering over the nuclear button. For 13 tense days in October 1962, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. Every passing hour brought new developments, each more alarming than the last. The stakes could not have been higher. The fate of millions hung in the balance as Kennedy and Khrushchev played a dangerous game of chicken. As the crisis unfolded, the world held its breath. In Washington, the halls of power buzzed with activity as Kennedy and his advisors debated their next move. In Moscow, Khrushchev wrestled with his own advisors, torn between his desire to stand firm and his fear of all-out war. Meanwhile, in Havana, Castro braced for the worst, knowing that his island could become ground zero in a nuclear conflict. Amid the escalating tensions, secret negotiations took place behind the scenes. Kennedy and Khrushchev exchanged letters through diplomatic channels, seeking a way out of the crisis without losing face. Both leaders understood the risks of nuclear war and were eager to find a solution that would satisfy their respective domestic audiences. The negotiations were tense and fraught with mistrust. Each side suspected the other of bad faith, and progress was slow. But gradually, a framework for a settlement began to take shape. Kennedy proposed a deal. If the Soviets removed their missiles from Cuba, the US would pledge not to invade the island and secretly remove its own missiles from Turkey. On October 28, 1962, the world breathed a collective sigh of relief as news broke that the crisis had been averted. In a dramatic televised address, Kennedy announced that the Soviets had agreed to withdraw their missiles from Cuba. In return, the United States pledged not to invade the island and secretly removed its missiles from Turkey. The announcement was met with jubilation around the world. For the first time in weeks, the threat of nuclear war seemed to recede. In Washington, Kennedy was hailed as a hero for his cool-headed leadership during the crisis. In Moscow, Khrushchev's decision to back down was met with mixed reactions. But most Russians were relieved that war had been avoided. As the dust settled, the full extent of the Cuban Missile Crisis's impact began to emerge. The world had come perilously close to nuclear war, and the scars would linger for years to come. In the aftermath of the crisis, both superpowers took steps to reduce the risk of future confrontations. For the United States, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a wake-up call. Kennedy vowed to strengthen America's nuclear deterrent and invest in civil defense measures to protect the population in the event of a nuclear attack. The crisis also prompted a reevaluation of U.S. foreign policy, with a renewed focus on diplomacy and arms control. One of the key weapons in the United States' arsenal during the Cuban Missile Crisis was economic sanctions. In addition to the naval blockade, Kennedy imposed a wide range of economic sanctions on Cuba, aimed at isolating the island and weakening Castro's regime. These sanctions had far-reaching consequences for the Cuban economy and its people. The economic sanctions imposed by the United States were designed to cripple Cuba's economy and force Castro to capitulate. They included restrictions on trade, travel, and financial transactions, making it difficult for Cuba to import essential goods and services. The goal was to put pressure on Castro's government and compel him to abandon his alliance with the Soviet Union. The economic sanctions imposed by the United States had a devastating impact on the Cuban economy. Overnight, Cuba found itself cut off from its largest trading partner and unable to access vital resources such as food, fuel, and machinery. The Cuban people bore the brunt of the sanctions, facing shortages of food, medicine, and other basic necessities. Despite the hardships, Castro refused to back down. He rallied the Cuban people behind him, portraying the sanctions as a form of economic warfare waged by the imperialist United States. Castro implemented rationing and price controls to mitigate the impact of the sanctions, but the Cuban economy continued to struggle under the weight of the embargo. The economic sanctions imposed by the United States were met with condemnation from the international community. Many countries viewed the sanctions as a violation of Cuba's sovereignty and a form of collective punishment against its people. The United Nations General Assembly repeatedly voted to condemn the embargo, calling for its immediate repeal. Despite the international outcry, the United States remained steadfast in its support for the sanctions. The Cuban Missile Crisis had left a deep scar on the American psyche, and many policymakers saw the embargo as a necessary tool to contain the spread of communism in the Western Hemisphere. As a result, the sanctions remained in place for decades, with devastating consequences for the Cuban people. The The Cuban Missile Crisis was a turning point in the Cold War, marking the closest the world had ever come to nuclear war. It served as a wake-up call for both superpowers, highlighting the dangers of brinkmanship and the need for diplomacy to resolve conflicts. The crisis also had a lasting impact on Cuba, shaping its relationship with the United States and the wider world. For the United States, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a lesson in the dangers of unchecked aggression. Kennedy's cool-headed leadership during the crisis earned him praise at home and abroad, but it also raised questions about the wisdom of American foreign policy. The crisis prompted a shift towards détente and arms control, as both superpowers sought to avoid a repeat of the brinkmanship that had brought them to the edge of nuclear war.